Hello and welcome to the History Chronicles. If you like our work, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you would like to support the channel in return for exclusive perks, please visit our Patreon page. Now, on with the video. Today's History Chronicle begins in the year 192 AD, on the 31st of December. That year, the Roman Emperor Commodus was drowned by a wrestler by the name of Narcissus in his bathtub in Rome. And although he can't have been aware of it at the time, Narcissus's act of drowning the Roman ruler would be symbolic of the first major act in the long collapse of the Roman Empire over the next 3 centuries. In 192 AD, the Roman Empire seemed strong, almost invincible. It ruled over a vast territory stretching from Spain and Morocco in the western Mediterranean all the way to Syria and the borders of modern-day Iraq in the east, while its armies held sway in much of Britain and Germany on its northern frontier and over everything north of the Sahara Desert in North Africa. But all was not well. The Roman system was based on resource extraction from the countries it conquered. When the empire stopped expanding in the 2nd century AD, the empire's economy began to stagnate. This was largely because the Roman Empire never developed a large-scale industry, but remained a broadly agrarian economy. Additionally, centuries of military conquests had resulted in the Roman legions, and the generals which commanded them, acquiring excessive political influence. Finally, the northern frontier of the empire in Germany and further east around the northern edges of the Balkans remained a security threat. Beyond lay a vast expanse of territory stretching towards Scandinavia, Russia, and the Asian steppes, which was dominated by Germanic tribes. These were less advanced cultures than Rome in terms of their military technology and administrative abilities, but what they lacked in these respects, they more than made up for with sheer numbers. Throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, there had been intermittent wars between the Romans and these Germanic tribes, who often tried to cross over the River Rhine and the River Danube, which the Romans had established as the northern boundaries of their empire in Europe. The first signs of the breakdown of order occurred in the immediate aftermath of Commodus's death. 193 AD has become known as the Year of the 5 Emperors, owing to the fact that 5 emperors were proclaimed that year, each supported by different Roman legions in the provinces. But eventually, Septimius Severus was victorious, and the Severan dynasty which he founded was able to maintain control over the imperial title for nearly 40 years. But the civil war of 193 AD was a sure sign of the problems that lay ahead. These exploded in the year 235 AD when Alexander Severus, the last ruler of the Severan dynasty, died. There now followed 50 years of almost constant civil war, wherein Roman legions from various provinces proclaimed their own commander as the Emperor of Rome, and challenged the incumbent in the capital for control of the empire. Between 235 and 285 AD, there were nearly 24 official emperors, and there were also many more claimants to the throne. A large portion of these emperors ruled for just a few months, while a period in office of 4 or 5 years during the 3rd century, before being ousted by another pretender, was thought of as a relatively successful reign. As a result, the empire was thrown into rampant internal disorder. What was worse, this near-perpetual state of internal civil war was occurring at a time when the empire could least afford it. The 3rd century saw the empire hit by several other calamities. A pandemic known as the Cyprian Plague raged through the empire for over a decade between the late 240s and the early 260s. The exact nature of this epidemic is unknown, though it was most likely a species of smallpox, influenza, or a filovirus. At its height in the 250s AD, several hundred people were said to be dying every day in the city of Rome and its surroundings. By the time it ended in the early 260s AD, some of the largest cities in the empire, such as Alexandria in northern Egypt and Carthage in modern-day Tunisia, had lost as much as half their inhabitants. This demographic crisis was compounded by variable weather cycles during the 3rd century, which caused widespread harvest failures and regional famines. Seeing the demographic crisis and the civil wars within the Roman Empire, the Germanic tribes beyond the River Rhine and River Danube began to take advantage of the weakness of their neighbour. Beginning in the 230s AD, German tribes such as the Goths, the Alemanni, and the Franks began pushing over the Roman Empire's borders. These raids occurred all along the northern border, from the eastern end of the Balkans to the Low Countries in Western Europe. When the empire was increasingly unable to prevent these incursions, it instead began to accommodate the German tribes by hiring them into the Roman legions and settling them in distinct communities within the empire. Over time, this would lead to a Germanization of the empire in Europe, a trend which would contribute to its fall in time. The late 3rd century saw concerted efforts to stop the decline. In 284 AD, a new emperor by the name of Diocletian came to power. He attempted to reform the empire, in particular by dividing it into two halves. Henceforth, there would be a Western Roman Empire based on Western Europe and the Western Mediterranean, and the Eastern Roman Empire, consisting of the territories in the Balkans, Turkey, the Levant, Egypt, and Libya. This would have significant implications for the history of Europe for the next 1200 years. One of Diocletian's near successors also introduced reforms which had long-lasting repercussions. Like so many of his 3rd century predecessors, the Emperor Constantine came to power in 312 AD after a lengthy civil war. He soon attributed his final victory in the war at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, near the city of Rome itself, to the intervention of the Christian god. Rome was a pagan or polytheistic empire where multiple gods were worshipped, but in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the followers of Jesus Christ, or Christians as they termed themselves, had gained enormous numbers of adherents throughout the Mediterranean. Constantine now adopted the religion himself and made it the official religion of the empire. He also built a new capital for the Eastern Roman Empire on the Bosphorus, in the southeast of the Balkans. This he modestly called Constantinople, though today we know it as Istanbul. While Diocletian and Constantine had stabilized the empire after the crises of the 3rd century, this was ultimately just a pause in the eventual collapse of Rome. In the second half of the 4th century, the empire was exposed to an even more extreme set of invasions by new German tribes, such as the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Franks, the Vandals, the Alans, and the Burgundians. These were now penetrating even further into the empire, and at the height of their raids they won a remarkable victory over the Eastern Empire at Adrianople in 378 AD, not far from Constantinople itself. Here, a Roman army led by the Emperor Valens was crushed by a combined force of Goths and Alans, while the Emperor Valens himself was killed in the course of the battle. Additionally, the western and eastern parts of the empire were increasingly acting without any sense of unity. They were instead trying to protect the interests of their respective rulers in Rome and Constantinople. In the years following the defeat at Adrianople, a policy of directing these German tribes in the Balkans westwards towards the Western Empire was adopted by the Eastern emperors at Constantinople. Foremost amongst these Germanic commanders who first entered the Eastern Empire and then moved on to Italy was Alaric I, king of the Visigoths, or Western Goths. Beginning in 402 AD, he undertook a series of invasions of the Italian peninsula. These culminated in 410 AD in the sacking of the city of Rome itself, the first time a foreign enemy had captured the imperial city in 800 years. It was all downhill from there for the Western Roman Empire. The same year that Rome was sacked, the Roman legions pulled out of Britain in the knowledge that it could no longer be defended. This was the first permanent loss of a province of the empire, and in the years that followed, the German incursions into Western Germany, Austria, Switzerland, France and Italy became more and more sustained. In part, this was owing to the German tribes being pushed westwards by their own formidable enemy. In the early 5th century, a highly aggressive people known as the Huns were pushing into Central Europe, having migrated from the Asian steppes over a period of several centuries. Under their leader, Attila, they would soon present the greatest threat yet seen to the Western Roman Empire. Attila the Hun is generally understood as being a major figure in the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but it is important to remember that he was just the latest in a long series of warlords who were able to impose their might over the crumbling power of Rome. By the mid-5th century, the situation was chronic. While the Eastern Roman Empire was able to sustain itself to some extent, the Western Empire had largely been overrun by the various German tribes. An indication of the free rein these groups had is seen in the actions of the Vandals. Originating in modern-day Poland, this tribe had moved into France, or the Roman province of Gaul, by 405 AD, and by the 410s they were marauding throughout the Iberian Peninsula, before eventually crossing to North Africa in the 430s. Having founded a kingdom in Carthage, they raided across the Mediterranean in 455 AD and sacked Rome for the second time in its imperial history. They left their name as a byword for mindless vandalism as a result. The actions of tribes such as the Vandals, and in particular the Huns in the 450s and 460s AD, brought the Western Roman Empire effectively to an end. The emperors, who now ruled from Ravenna in northern Italy, had ceased to exercise any real authority throughout Western Europe or North Africa by this time. The last Roman emperor in the west was Romulus Augustus, who reigned briefly from 475 to 476 AD. He was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic warlord of unclear origins who was in the employ of the Roman army, and who in 476 AD simply decided to dispense with Romulus altogether and crowned himself as King of Italy. This is typically understood to mark the end of the Western Roman Empire. The empire was replaced by a number of successor kings, generally dominated by certain Germanic tribes. The Vandals controlled much of North Africa. The Visigoths conquered the bulk of the Iberian Peninsula and established a kingdom there which lasted for nearly 300 years. The Roman province of Gaul fell to the Franks and a number of smaller tribes such as the Burgundians, while the Belgae settled in the Low Countries around the modern-day country of Belgium, having first been conquered by the Ostrogoths. Italy was subsequently overrun in the 6th century by the Lombards, particularly to the north of the country, which is known to this day as the Plain of Lombardy. Finally, a number of tribes such as the Saxons and the Angles moved into Britain after the Romans pulled out. In time, they created the culture known as Anglo-Saxon England. What followed for several centuries in Western Europe was a period known as the Dark Ages, as the learning and culture which had characterized the Roman Republic and early empire was lost. Yet, it was in this firmament that the states of modern Europe would first begin to emerge. Most significantly, the changes which Constantine had introduced in the midst of the crises of the Roman Empire lived on, and the civilization which emerged in Europe after the Dark Ages was one dominated by the followers of Christ, the Christians whose faith Constantine had promoted in the early 4th century. The Eastern Roman Empire survived for another 1,000 years, and in the 6th century the Eastern Emperor Justinian even managed to reconquer certain parts of Italy and North Africa. However, from the 7th century onwards, the imperial power based out of Constantinople entered a period of gradual decline, as tribes such as the Bulgars overran much of its territory in the Balkans, and the Arab followers of Muhammad built a caliphate, which absorbed all of its North African possessions and much of its lands in the Levant. These setbacks aside, it was not until 1453, when the armies of the Ottoman Turkish Sultan Mehmed II began pounding on Constantinople's formidable walls, that the city of Constantine finally fell, 1,200 years after its establishment. We'd love to know your opinion on the fall of the Roman Empire. Please let us know below, and if you enjoyed our video, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out. Also, if you'd like to support our work going forward, please visit our Patreon page, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next episode of the History Chronicles.